Module 3, we looked at some specific ideas and examples for how Education for Sustainable Development, SDG 4.7, and climate education can be integrated into existing classrooms across subjects. In Module 4, we continue this discussion with some ideas for how this work can be done in ways that involve and contribute to solutions in the wider community around the school, enabling learning that can cross spaces to be more relevant, contextualized, and connected to learners' lives. We'll explore essential questions such as, why is it important to connect ESD and SDG 4.7 learning to learners' lived experiences and communities? Beyond traditional textbooks and content, what are ways that educators can engage different community stakeholders in the learning experience? How can schools serve as community hubs to facilitate action and problem solving beyond the classroom? And what are some helpful frameworks and themes that can support an action-oriented mindset in learners? Let's start with our experts' discussion of why it's important to connect ESD to learners' experiences and communities, and some of the enabling supports and tools that can help schools and educators make those connections.
I think here one important responsibility lies really with curriculum developers, and to have curricula in place that leave enough flexibility for the individual teacher and for the individual school to really adapt to the local context and to really integrate into their lesson planning stakeholders in the community.
We are a small office and we are not the experts on New York City communities. We are here to learn, to listen, to understand all these unique, diverse communities in New York City and say, here are some tools and resources. What does this look like for your community?
Because if you're talking halfway around the world to a bunch of fourth graders, they don't make the connections. But if you're talking about halfway down the block, it makes a lot more sense and they can relate and it gets them physically and emotionally connected to the issue.
We've been promoting the general message of climate change, that the ice caps are melting and there's plastic in the oceans for a really long time. And not a lot of people have taken that in. That's why it's always been like an environmental thing. But when we contextualize, like right now around the corner, trash incinerators are not only putting things in the atmosphere, but they're putting chemicals into people's lungs and people are getting asthma. The closer that we can get it to people's lives, I think we need to promote that mentality and promote that story, because we have to make it urgent.
The most authentic youth leadership is adults and young people working together.
In order to develop their own self-directed plans of action for their schools and communities, to get this co-engaged communities of practice involving the children, the parents, the community members and teachers, to make decisions about what it is that they wanted to do in and around their school in order to address environmental challenges such as water, climate change, energy, peaceful co-engagement with each other, anti-racism, and so on.
Of course, it's very important also to work together with activists in the community, that have their own way of raising visibility of the issue.
So every school district that's in a community that's moving towards sustainability has an authentic context in which to engage kids. People need testing done. They need systems models built. They need social histories done. The communities have a lot of needs, and schools need to teach all of that. And so schools and children and teachers are natural partners in this. In authentic ways, they can be learning what they need to learn and contributing to sustainable community development, and particularly to indicator tracking.
What's your priorities as an administrator? What do students really care about, and how can we take what matters to you and open this door of sustainability and change and behavior change and integration in the curriculum?
And then ideally, of course, also students go outside of the classroom and help the community in a way to address climate change. And all of that is in itself, of course, a learning experience.
Now that we've built our understanding of why it's important to connect learning to communities, what are some ways to connect with different stakeholders, local phenomena, and everyday learner experiences in the community to make learning more engaging?
We're always looking for opportunities to tie in local phenomena. That's a big part of science education and the next generation science standards is exploring phenomena, but it's so much better when students can do that in their community. So students near the Gowanus Canal exploring combined sewage overflow and rain gardens.
In the rural farming community of Harlem Valley that they did open up the school for us to come and show the work that we were doing on our medicinal herb farm, be able to share healthy beverages with the students. And then maybe some students would be like, hey, I'd like to come see your farm sometime. And we'd be like, okay, let's set that up. Maybe we can even do a field trip with a group of interested students and teachers and take it from there.
People within individualized environmental careers should step in more and talk to kids about their careers. For example, my sustainable teacher would always ask, what's a guest speaker you want to see? And every time I would write a sustainable engineer, a renewable engineer. I want to see how it's like as an engineer, because if I know how it's like, then I'll want to go in that field. I'll see if it's right for me.
I facilitated and created this program called Speak with a Scientist. So I've been bringing scientists into the classroom to speak with my students. Sometimes it's been political people as well, to speak with my students, to share with them some of the awesome stuff that is happening.
One of the projects we're working on now is to create what we call a student climate summit. And the objective is to get the local colleges all throughout the state to host these activities, these programs, where kids from all over the state, where they're local to the individual colleges, can come for a series of talks and discussions all about what is actually happening locally, as well as globally.
As an example of how I've addressed this is through a partnership with our local watershed association, where we use problem-based learning to engage students in science and solutions of sustainability issues. Here, students were in the field collecting water quality data and then applied it to developing solutions to ensure sustainability in our local swamp, which is part of a national wildlife refuge. And all of these are giving them a skill base that, even though we might not have covered it during the course of the year, they can carry it with them into the future and look at it. When they're presented with a problem in the future, they now have this lens to unpack that problem.
So when we bring them into the lab, usually high school students, it's for about 5 weeks. They come twice a week. And over that 2-week period, we try and, apart from the protocols and other stuff, we try to help them understand what is the big picture. And so we sometimes go to the market, get some samples of food that they would traditionally eat at home. So we would go to different stores and buy all the shrimp that we get from different parts of the world. And they would analyze them and look at which shrimp from which country had the most plastics in them. And then we would teach them the process of how those plastics get into the aquatic system. So typically at the end of this program, we expect them to write a report and a poster for their school. And they told me that the response was overwhelming for them.
One concept we heard from many of the experts we talked with is the concept of schools as community hubs. More than integrating these ideas into classroom learning, and even beyond connecting with stakeholders in the community, schools can actually serve as the hubs from which community organizing and action can happen to yield big impacts.
We always talk about thinking of schools as these like resilient community hubs. If we want change, it's not going to come from me going into a building and forcing everyone to sort their waste. It has to come from the school community, and schools are such central places in communities that if it's happening there, and if there's community involvement, and if there's gardening, if there's thinking, if there's connecting, then it will spread out to the community and the parents and the families. We are always helping educators create student-led green teams. And I think what's so important about green teams is students really get to come together and say, what's an issue in our school community? That might be there's not enough outdoor space. They want to create benches in their school community. They want to clean up the litter in their neighborhood. And that allows students to say, here are my priorities, and this is how we want to accomplish it.
I helped organize like 2 climate strikes. The first one got like 500 students at my school to walk out, organize activism to going to other climate strikes, got really involved in the environmental club, collaborating with the Students for Justice Club. We organized like a thrift sale that fundraised for the Newark Water Coalition, which is an organization kind of fighting the water and lead crisis, which definitely has to do with the environment and health. And it was really such a learning process, like putting together speeches and actually having to know what I'm talking about. And so doing research like, wow, this is happening and this is directly affecting us. I really think just my life has transformed in the way that I approach like advocacy and the things that I want to change in the larger world, but also like the small changes I want to make in my life, like not buying from big corporations that are not only exploiting people ethically, but are also exploiting the planet, and composting and just doing what I can, but also knowing that it's larger than me.
So everything that I do, whether I'm working with students or whether I'm working with teachers, is extremely student-centered. So I try to make it connect to their own lives. And I think that that is really the key, building relationships with students and with youth. I think that's really the key in climate change education. So for example, a lot of my students were not aware of the fact that fracking waste actually used to be brought into Connecticut, which is the location where I teach. And so we did a lot of knowledge talking about what fracking is, how does that have to do with us and our communities. And from there, students actually brainstormed that they wanted to write letters to their government, and they wanted to advocate to have fracking waste stop being brought into Connecticut because it was harming their community. This was in my science class, but that easily could have been taught as well as a civics class. And I was not even the one that was kind of bringing this up. My students were super engaged in this. They felt very strongly about it. And so I was facilitating and supporting them. For me, it was providing them the resources, the name of the senator that they should be writing to, helping them draft a letter because they had never done that to government before. But we're really there as kind of guides. I think this generation, especially coming up, is extremely action-oriented already. If you even look at what they're doing on TikTok, there's so many climate change action TikTok videos. So I think we're very privileged that the youth that are coming up, A, care about their environment, B, are extremely action-oriented, whether it's talking about the Black Lives Matter movement or climate change. And so what they just need is a forum and some support in taking that action.
Every day, New York City serves almost 1 million meals, and they were all being served on these styrofoam trays. And some students, some community groups, some nonprofits were not happy about this. It was like, this is crazy. Every day, almost 1 million trays are ending up in our landfill garbage. So some students in Manhattan built these monsters out of the styrofoam trays, these massive puppets. Cafeteria Culture, one of our nonprofit partners, did some data analysis of how many trays are coming out of schools every day. And they marched to City Hall to demand the change from styrofoam trays to a tray alternative. So the mayor's office, Office of Food and Nutrition Services said, let's look into this. Like, this is obviously an issue. We're hearing it from multiple schools, multiple boroughs, multiple entities. And so school food wanted to switch over to a compostable tray. But they were like, we can't do this. The styrofoam tray costs 4 cents a tray. This compostable tray is 15 cents a tray. So financially, it was just not possible. So New York City formed the Urban School Food Alliance. It's an organization that connects multiple school districts, and it started with LA Public Schools, Chicago Public Schools, New York City Public Schools, and Miami Public Schools. And once they got this group together, they had something like 3.3 million students. And with that many students, the price of the tray was able to drop to something like 6 cents. And so I think it was 2015, New York City made the transition from the styrofoam tray to the compostable tray. Parents and community members and sustainability coordinators and students really didn't want palm oil in the Office of Food and Nutrition Services meals. And that was another campaign where students wrote letters, talked to school food, and they decided to ban palm oil in any of the school meals because of the environmental impacts. And we get our cookies, I think it's from Ludwig, it's a cookie maker, and they didn't want to lose the contract with New York City schools. So they completely changed their cookie recipe to take out palm oil. And so that's another example of how when you're a city this big with 1.1 million students, you can actually change private industry.
Thinking about these examples of how education for sustainable development and SDG 4.7 can be integrated, it's valuable to also think about some helpful frameworks and themes that educators can explore with learners in order to help them understand the underlying power structures and avenues for advocating for policy change, as well as some of the tensions that exist in working toward change.
The biggest insight that I think could be helpful is this Powers of 10 framework, to take a look at the connection between a single individual and 10 orders of magnitude up to approaching 10 billion people on the planet is a way that we can start to look at ourselves individually, collectively, because if we're talking about national scales, nations vary in size from a few tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people up to over a billion people. We did this paper using data from Project Drawdown to estimate the range of over 70 different strategies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And what we found is that most of them can actually be deployed and have benefits at a community scale of about 10,000 to 100,000 people. And so that's a scale that's really local in a certain sense, but it's also a bridge to the national scales, the global scales.
Just going over basic structures of who has power is really important. You can think of it locally, like local governments or like statewide governments, who has the power and how they're connected to the players that are causing the climate crisis, like the fossil fuel industry, and then connect that to like larger issues of how the ruling class oppresses working class people. That's really central, I think, in understanding climate change, because it's an issue of who has power to make these decisions and who doesn't have power and has to deal with the consequences of people in power. And then that can also lead to people figuring out how to gain back that power.
I feel like our entire lives that we've always sought out justice, that we've always sought out awareness and that kind of connection with people, that if people understand that these things are happening to what may seem like a small population of Indigenous people in one area of the world, then perhaps they can connect to that and realize that what's happening is even greater, that it's affecting me too, hundreds of miles away.
When we look at the traditional teachings as Indigenous people and we see this earth as a living life force, our grandmother would state and tell us that the liver of the earth is the coal, and it acts as a filtration system. This is kind of traditional knowledge. And she would talk about, the almost in a scientific regard of the breakdown of, okay, the forest, that is like the hair, and describe how each function within our body, is connected or related with the earth. And in a traditional sense, it's like digging or extracting or harming this earth and this environment, creates imbalances, creates sicknesses, illnesses.
Unfortunately, there are places where people are taken advantage of due to the fact that they feel, and it justly so, that they're ignored or they're not listened to. And these communities, for example, anybody near an old factory or a dumping ground for materials have every right that the rest of the community has to keep their environment as safe as possible for them and their families. And when any issue is considered in terms of the environment and environmental impacts, these communities now have to be included. We set up a law now that anytime an issue comes up where these communities are affected, they have to be considered. So we have a social justice and an environmental justice ruling that the state has approved. So in the future, any conversations about them have to be included. So that's hopefully going to have a long-term impact that way.
One thing we've talked about here, we have a partnership with the local school division, and this came up there because we're in a region of the country where there is high oil sands, and next door in Alberta, there's been cases of, conflict in the community when climate issues are addressed in the classroom and you have parents working in the oil and gas sector, and becomes very fraught. But, I said to the teachers when we were working with them the other month that there are not two sides to climate change. It's a scientific reality that we are experiencing human-induced climate change, and what there are complex factors of if we all want our children and grandchildren to be able to live on this planet, and for people now not to be suffering. I mean, I don't think anyone wants that, right? But what people are afraid of is, how am I going to put food on the table for my family next week, which we all want to. So trying to move it away from anything like there's two sides, but instead we all want health for our families and communities, and how do we work together to accomplish that.
Now we've explored some ideas for how to design learning experiences that connect with and help address challenges in the community, while giving learners windows into potential pathways for making a difference through their citizenship, their creativity, and their future careers. In our action framework for Module 3, we asked you to consider what resources exist in your community that you can bring into your classroom. This list is a great place to look to for possible community projects and actions that you can get your learners involved with. For example, are there any examples of sustainability-oriented legislation or other government initiatives that need more grassroots support and awareness? How can learners use persuasive writing, local data, service projects, or art to build local awareness? You might also add community organizations or local chapters of state or national organizations doing sustainable development work to this list. Connect with any colleges or universities in your area to find out if there are opportunities to engage your learners with their research work and give them that insight into possible pathways for further study and future careers. Next, find out if there is someone at your district or school who can act as a community liaison to help build these community learning partnerships and help coordinate with parent groups and other key partners to help make your school more of a hub for sustainable development in your community. In our next and final module, Module 5, we pull the action framework components we've been building at the end of each module together and connect them to ideas for how education for sustainable development efforts can connect to broader movements to monitor and measure progress toward SDG 4.7. The more we can tell our stories for how education is helping to build the movement toward a sustainable future, the more we can push institutions to take action, and the faster we can move toward addressing climate change and the myriad sustainable development challenges we want to solve.